So welcome to my thoughts on episode 1 of GquuuuuX. In this video I will be going over a few points of interest with a few comparisons to the original series. And it also turns out the video released last week, which I thought was basically the episode 0, is actually based on episode 2. So if you want to watch this week's episode, which should be out now because I've been really slow on release of this one, you can just watch that. Just to give a quick review of the actual episode before I actually get into the nitty-gritty details and issues I might have, is overall I think it's decent. I think most of my complaints are all based on existing prior knowledge, so if you have no idea about the original series, you should theoretically enjoy this. And some of the points of interest are actually things I just find interesting as well, rather than just like some of them are complaints, but this is fine. Yeah. The one thing I was initially a bit worried about was the episode order. I think the issue here is I watched it in the movie format where it was in chronological order, and so that just seems normal to me, how it should be. But I think I've talked to enough people that I think the actual episode 2 would not be a good starting point because it just too much happens really fast and it's not exactly easy to keep up with. And I think personally I found it fine, but I could also fill in all the gaps, like all missing gaps in information I already basically had going into it. And then I think one of the other things I was a bit worried about was like thinking it would be confusing going in from like there's some characters who are referenced that you have no idea about, but I think watching it again, one, is not a big deal because if that was the case, people would probably just expect it to be explained later. And then there's not actually that much reference to it. Like you have Charlie Able searching for something, but he doesn't actually really mention what it is. I've just been mentioning Red Gundam, and that's basically, but actually mentioning Char at all. Definitely, I think is a positive in that respect, because if they did start talking about Char, I think it would be a negative if they don't actually mention him. So the first point of interest, which is also, I guess, the first in chronological order, kind of, is the installer device, which for some reason in the subtitles is translated to installer key, even though Machu clearly says installer device. It's clearly in katakana, it's clearly just installer device. I generally don't know why they did that. I guess it's the same as going back to the wooden horse and rocking horse and Trojan horse. But hey, this is fine. Yeah, I do think the installer device is a neat concept, and it looks a bit like a cross between the device thing, the circuitry that Emero's dad gives him on side 6, and a modern hard drive. It even has like the serial number, also looks like something you'd find on like a Western Digital device. Because this is the thing his dad gives him, and it sort of has references on that. I am curious about whether it's a post-war modification, like did they take the military suits and then find a way to civilianize them, which could then be reversed, or if this was meant to already be a thing, where the suits are basically off the assembly line civilian and then you just put this on to make them military. But yeah, so going into sort of like explaining like what this thing is and how it works. So with a mobile suit, you will input a command to tell it to do something, like move forwards, for instance, and then there'll be a central control computer that will then make the mobile suit do what you just told it to. So the idea behind these devices is that the base civilian model of the Zaku doesn't have any, essentially you can't tell it to do military actions or combat related actions because it doesn't have them in its system, so it can't actually do those things. So the idea behind this is so you plug this in, and there's sort of like interfaces slash installs into the central control system, giving access to all the combat related tasks that they'd be doing. I feel like the translators used key as it almost looks like it's unlocking these features, but it definitely looks like there's some sort of installation thing happening. So I guess it's more of like a game cartridge or a memory stick or something that's interfacing with the actual system to give you access to them rather than unlocking them. One last thought on these is they have the ability to interface with them and actually essentially look inside it, although I do believe they thought this was broken, but then when Matthew puts it into Zaku, it actually works, so maybe they actually can't interface with it, but theoretically they could. So I would be curious. Wait a minute. That's quite literally, that's a SATA cable. And that's a 4-pin Molex cable. So these are like civilian parts on the current market. And this must be the actual, essentially it's converting the signal and power from these into the one that interfaces with the actual device itself. Don't know what that and that's for. I didn't just notice that. But yeah. So I'm curious if they'd be able to, if they can use interface like this, if they could make their own version of this. But I think the issue of that is you'd need a lot of prior knowledge of all commands and stuff. And potentially we could see a custom one in the future if they wanted to cover that. But yeah, so the second point I have is the GquuuuuX itself. So they've been given the GquuuuuX to use, which is basically an experimental test model, but then they've been told they're not allowed using the Omega Psi commune. And then they are given the device slash key to activate it for some reason as well. But then like from what you can tell, like from anime, it's almost like it barely scratches the full potential of the mobile suit without the Psi commune activated. So it's kind of seems interesting, because if it was me, I wouldn't want to risk an experimental test model by sending it out without it being able to actually function properly, unless it was like in a controlled environment, which does seem a bit weird, but it's quite possible that when they were told something like this: do not use the Omega Psi commune, wink, wink. Maybe. It might have been something like that. That's the only way I can actually explain it. Like, they probably weren't hoping they'd use it anyway, and they don't want to get in trouble, so they told them not to. Yeah, so the third point I want to talk about is the getting into the Gundam sequence, the titular most important part of the first episode of every single Gundam show. So in the original series, so obviously Amuro is walking around, he stumbles upon the manual for the RX-78, and he starts reading it until Thor actually basically snaps him out of it and gets him moving again. He then gets into the cockpit, but he actually, because he read at least the start of the manual, he has an idea of how the movement controls work, so he basically spends a bit of time figuring out where everything is. He then managed to... He struggles a bit to stand up in the Gundam, but he does actually manage to do it. And then eventually he needs to find where the weapons are, so he looks through a manual for where the weapons are. Yeah, and then when it comes down to the fighting, the one point to note is that the machine guns from the Zaku's can't actually damage the Gundam at all. And it doesn't look like either of the ones in the colony have heat hawks on them. And then so what happens next is you have Jean, who's the rookie, basically charges at Amuro. the Gundam in response basically grabs and damages part of the head of the Zaku, which essentially disables its main camera. And there's actually no indication whether Amuro actually commands it to do so, or it does it out of instinct. Like it's just a self-defense mechanism or something. But then from that point onwards, they're basically Denim and basically tries to get Jean to escape by helping out get escape, and they're basically going to run away, right? At that point, Amuro's able to chase down Jean and destroy him with his beam saber, which causes Denim to start charging Amuro, and then he manages to beam saber the cockpit, taking out both the Zaku's. One thing to mention that we don't actually bring up until a bit later, and honestly might not actually apply so early, is that the RX-78 is self-learning. So as it fights, it learns how to better carry out the commands it's given. So basically, over the course of the original series, Amuro basically grows as a pilot. He gets more skilled as a pilot, and he also starts developing new type abilities as he goes along. So he basically uses a lot of progressive skills as he gets better and better. One last thing I would like to mention, at least before we go on to the what happens in GquuuuuX, is I've seen people comment on how Matthew sees the military police destroying refugees' houses and is like, this is wrong, I need to do something about this. I think they were trying to make a parallel, as usually there's a lot of reluctance when it comes to getting into the giant robots with the main characters in Gundam. The issue is, in the original series, Amuro sees the Zaku's damaging his home, and he wants to get into the Gundam to stop them. Later on in the series, he gets very, very reluctant to fight because he's constantly fighting. But at least in this first episode, he's in a very similar situation as she is. Like with similar sort of emotions and stuff. Okay, so now we're on to the GquuuuuX version. I'm assuming the armor situation will be the same. But how it starts is Matthew gets into the cockpit of the Gundam, and then the Omega Psi commune activates, which converts the cockpit from a more traditional setup into a more controlled by new type power setup, where essentially, and then Matthew puts her hands on these things, which then activates, essentially connects her brain to the Gundam, where essentially instead of telling Gundam what to do via physical inputs, she's able to use the mind to tell it to do stuff. She managed to get it to stand up, which isn't really showing if she's struggling or anything, you just see the outside part of that. And then she starts thinking about a weapon. The suit detects a heat orc on the ground, and essentially jumps over to grab it while dodging an attack from the current Zaku that's currently in the tunnel thing with her. And then I think the Zaku is about to do another attack on her, and then she essentially flinches up away, covering herself to defend herself, like physically in the cockpit, which the Gundam then responds to by essentially heat-hawking the Zaku in the cockpit, killing the pilot. And then she ends up being backed up against an airlock when the other Zaku comes around the corner with its rifle and starts shooting at her, which then opens the airlock. And then the very large and very heavy Gundam is sucked out of the airlock when it opens. This part confounds me a bit. And technically you do see her step backwards like once, but then she just falls out and starts falling into space basically. And there's quite a lot of momentum that one step backwards wouldn't have caused this, I don't think. So she's basically struggling to control the Gundam as it's falling, so it's basically doing free falling while spinning a lot. But then the red Gundam shows up. And then she essentially uses, as the traditional new type, there's someone over there, she can detect that there's someone there, And then there's a new type, psychic communications with traditional rainbows and stuff. Afterwards, she's able to manage to get control of the Gundam. I think she grabs onto this thing that looks like a rope and steadies the Gundam. And then she's able to disable essentially take up the head of the other Zaku and disable it with no trouble at all. Like, she can just do it. Like, there's no struggle. She gets perfect control Gundam to take it out. I do feel like the Psy-Commune is a bit of a crutch for her. Like, not necessarily an issue against her, but I think it's a detriment to good character development. Like, I think by having it, they are limiting themselves to how she can develop as a character and as a pilot. But I do feel like there is still potential for that, because I feel like the difficulty she has initially controlling the Gundam does actually make sense. As even if you can tell it to do stuff, if you don't know what to tell it to do, you're going to struggle. And I think there's definitely room for development there as she figures out, like, how do I do this? I've no experience doing this, like, what do I do? And then she could instinctively slowly work it out and figure things out. I think that would be a good way to do it. And even the scene where she basically goes to protect herself and the Gundam takes out the Zaku, that can actually make sense because the Gundam was protecting itself. So it took her, like, I need to protect myself, to the correct decision of taking out the Zaku. And I think everything then falls down because once the Red Gundam comes along and she has that psychic connection with its pilot, she's suddenly able to magically perfectly do everything. Like, Amuro never had that. Like, he had to figure things out himself the hard way. Like, sure, he has probably more brain power than her. It's like, no offense to Matthew, she doesn't seem very smart. But, and he also has a manual. He has advantage, he actually has a manual to tell him what to do, and she doesn't. But I do feel like they could have actually written this in a way, if you just, maybe the Red Gundam shows up after she's dealt with the second Zaku, but make her fight with the second Zaku more meaningful. Actually, she has to figure things out. She's in space. Like, how do you move in space? Like, she's only ever walked. Like, she probably has some idea how to get the Gundam to walk in gravity, but in space there's no gravity. Like, she needs to be able to figure that stuff out, and I think you could still have a meaningful character development if she did that, but then they don't. They just give her another free win. So, like, I know you have a crutch already, but, like, how about we just hand everything to you on a plate by magically letting you know how to do this? But next week, we do have another instance of space combat to look forward to, where we can basically talk more about this. And maybe they've managed to turn things around or not. We'll find out next week on that one. The last point I want to make. The last point I want to make is about all the new type stuff. This is specifically about the la sound you hear when she does make the connection with the Red Gundam pilot and Hood of Rainbows. In the original series, that la sound is associated with la character, which honestly is a bit confusing that it's a la sound and the character's called la as well. I think they should have called it something different. But it's okay, it's too late now. It's been like 40-something years. So for those who haven't seen the original series, and even if you've seen episode 2, it won't explain any of this shit. But basically, Lala is a character on the Zeon side, and she is basically probably one of the most powerful new types that I can think of. And essentially, she uses a Psy-Commune like Char does with a Red Gundam to control bits like the Red Gundam has, right? and she can control from quite a long distance. So she's essentially using her mind to control these bits. And what will happen is people will often hear the sound la la in their heads, usually right before they're about to get killed by the bits. But basically my interpretation of this is that is the sound of her brain, like that's the sound like her brain waves make as they control those bits. So it's like theoretically with like a remote control car ride, there's technically a radio signal being sent to the car, and you could theoretically measure that. The way I see it is that la la is essentially those signals, and it's, to me, I associate specifically with la la. So my issue here is that the person in the Red Gundam, spoiler alerts, isn't Lala. Yeah, as I said at the start of the video, technically I've got a review for the next episode, which I guess I'll put in the cards somewhere. Oh, I think it's up here on the screen. On top, this corner of the screen. For my review on this, on the White Gundam episode, effectively. So yeah, this is the end of the video. Leave any comments below if you have any thoughts on the episode yourself, as I am interested in hearing everyone's point of view, because I think it does. You can develop a better point of view by hearing everyone, so that's what I want. But yeah, I will see you all next time. So next week we should have, hopefully a lot sooner than this one came out, the episode 3 review. But yeah, I'll see you all then, and have a good everything.